It was supposed to be a quiet neighborhood. A peaceful suburban escape where people kept their lawns neat, exchanged the occasional wave and minded their own business. That was the dream anyway. Then there was her. Karen. The self-appointed queen of the HOA, the enforcer of imaginary rules, the ultimate busybody with a clipboard permanently attached to her hand. She didn't just live in the neighborhood, she ruled over it like a petty dictator with a vendetta against anything remotely fun. I learned this the hard way when she showed up at my doorstep one afternoon, armed with a scowl and an attitude bigger than her overpriced lawn ornaments. She held up a notice with my name on it, her manicured nail tapping impatiently on the paper. "This is a violation," she announced. I took the paper, confused. "For what?" She pursed her lips, as if offended by my audacity to question her divine authority. "Your mailbox. It's not in compliance." I stared at my perfectly ordinary mailbox, the same as every other house on the street. "Karen, this is the exact same model the HOA approved." She gasped like I'd just told her I planned to paint my house neon green. "It's slightly crooked." She enunciated each word like she was explaining something to a child. I looked at it again. Maybe it leaned half a degree to the left. Maybe. "You called this a violation?" "I documented it," she corrected, brandishing a clipboard I was sure had seen more action than a police detective's case files. "You have until Friday to fix it." I could already tell. Karen was going to be a problem. And I had no idea just how bad it was going to get. It started small, as these things often do. A violation notice here, a passive-aggressive email there. Karen wasn't just enforcing the HOA rules, she was inventing them. One morning I stepped outside to find yet another notice taped to my door. I sighed, already knowing who was responsible. Sure enough, in bold, aggressive lettering, the reason for my offense was written out. Unauthorized lawn decor. I glanced at my front yard. The only thing remotely decorative was a single stone garden gnome, a harmless little guy in a red hat that had been sitting there for years. I looked back at the notice. Apparently, this tiny gnome was a serious threat to the aesthetic integrity of the neighborhood. "You've got to be kidding me," I muttered, crumpling the paper. As if summoned by the sheer force of my annoyance, Karen appeared on the sidewalk, arms crossed, chin raised in that self-righteous way of hers. "You need to remove that," she said, nodding toward my gnome as if it had personally insulted her ancestors. "It's a gnome, Karen. It's not HOA approved." I pinched the bridge of my nose. "Where does it say in the rules that I can't have a gnome?" She scoffed, clearly offended that I dared to question her authority. "It's implied." I stared at her. "Implied?" Her eyes narrowed. "Do you really want to go against the HOA?" That was the moment I knew. This wasn't about rules. This wasn't about gnomes or mailboxes or any of the other nonsense she'd been nitpicking over. This was a power trip. And Karen had officially declared war. From that day on, the ridiculousness escalated at an alarming speed. One morning I found another violation notice. "Grass height exceeds HOA standards." I bent down and measured it myself. 2 inches. Perfectly within regulations. The next day she left a note about my trash can being too visible from the street. It was trash pickup day. Then came the truly absurd moment. She handed me a fine for a single leaf on my driveway. "A leaf, Karen? A leaf." He shrugged. "We have to maintain standards." And just like that I realized something. Karen wasn't going to stop. No matter how many times I complied, she would find something else. It wasn't about following the rules. It was about control. And if she thought I was just going to roll over and let her bully me, she had another thing coming. I decided that if Karen wanted a battle, I'd give her one, but on my terms. See, some people fight fire with fire. Me, I prefer a more subtle approach. A little passive-aggressive compliance. A little rule-bending of my own. The first move was simple. Since Karen was so obsessed with my mailbox being exactly straight, I took out a level and measured it down to the millimeter. Then, just to mess with her, I repositioned it every few days. A hair to the left, a hair to the right. Never enough for anyone else to notice, but enough to drive her crazy. Then came the gnome situation. Since my single garden gnome was not HOA approved, I decided to remove it, technically. Instead, I replaced it with an entire army of tiny plastic flamingos. Not 1. Not 2. 30. They were everywhere. On my lawn. Lining the walkway. Staring down passers-by with their soulless little beady eyes. When Karen came storming down my driveway, clipboard in hand, she looked like she was about to have an aneurysm. "You think you're funny," she hissed, pointing at the flamingo horde. I shrugged innocently. "They're seasonal decor. HOA guidelines say seasonal decorations are allowed." "It's summer." Her eye twitched. She opened her mouth, then snapped it shut, realizing she couldn't argue. But she wasn't done. Oh no. A few days later, I received yet another violation notice. This time for my front door color. Apparently it was too bold. Too unsubtle. Too offensive to the suburban aesthetic. For the record, my door was beige. So I checked the HOA handbook again. Turns out, as long as you used an approved palette, any shade within that spectrum was allowed. Which is why the very next weekend I painted my door in the brightest, most obnoxious shade of legally compliant mustard yellow I could find. Not technically against the rules. Just incredibly annoying to Karen. She nearly lost her mind. From then on it became a game. I followed every rule to the letter, but in the most irritating way possible. If she said my trash cans were too visible, I built a comically oversized enclosure for them. If she claimed my grass was too tall, I cut it so short it looked like a golf course. No matter what, I made sure she couldn't find me, couldn't report me, couldn't do anything except seethe in pure, impotent rage. But Karen wasn't one to take a loss lightly. And soon she'd escalate things in a way I never saw coming. At first, it felt like I was fighting this battle alone. Just me, my passive-aggressive compliance, and Karen's ever-growing stack of ridiculous violation notices. But then something interesting started happening. The neighbors took notice. It started with Tom from next door. One evening, as I was positioning my 31st flamingo, he casually wandered over, beer in hand, and smirked. "She's losing her mind over this, isn't she?" he asked, nodding toward Karen's house. "Oh, absolutely." He took a sip and chuckled. "Good. Turns out I wasn't the only one she'd been tormenting. Tom had gotten fined because his garden hose wasn't coiled neatly enough. Mrs. Henderson down the street? Cited for an improperly positioned wreath on Thanksgiving. Even poor old Mr. Jenkins had received a written warning because his grandson's sidewalk chalk drawings were too colorful. Karen wasn't just enforcing rules, she was inventing them to keep the entire neighborhood under her control. And the best part? Everyone hated her for it. The more I pushed back, the more the neighbors started rallying behind me. Some were subtle, whispering words of encouragement when Karen wasn't looking. Others were more proactive. Like when Mrs. Lopez, who had always been quiet and polite, installed an entire inflatable Halloween display in her yard in July. Or when Mr. Henderson started accidentally mowing half of Karen's front lawn at 6 a.m. on Sundays. Then there was old Mr. Jenkins. He didn't say much, just sat on his porch rocking chair, watching the chaos unfold with a knowing smile. But one day I caught him outside casually sipping lemonade as he tied a bright red bandana around his cat's neck. "Karen says the HOA doesn't allow free-roaming pets." He grinned. Figured I'd make him look like a gang leader. Even the kids got involved. One afternoon, a group of them started riding their bikes up and down Karen's perfectly maintained sidewalk. On purpose. Every time she came outside to yell at them, they'd giggle and race away. It was like watching a real-life game of suburban guerrilla warfare. The best part? No one was actually breaking any rules. They were just making sure Karen had the worst possible time trying to enforce her imaginary ones. Of course, Karen wasn't blind. She could feel the neighborhood turning against her. And like any true HOA dictator backed into a corner, she decided it was time to escalate. That's when she made her biggest mistake yet. And it would cost her everything. I thought I had Karen figured out. I thought I knew how far she'd go. I was wrong. It started when I left for vacation. A well-earned break after dealing with her nonsense for months. 2 weeks in paradise, far away from HOA drama. Or so I thought. The first sign that something was off came the moment I pulled into my driveway upon returning home. At first, I thought I was in the wrong neighborhood. There were folding chairs scattered across my front yard. White satin ribbons still hung from my trees. Rose petals, actual rose petals, were sprinkled across my lawn. And smack in the middle of it all was a giant gold-trimmed sign. Congratulations to the newlyweds. I stepped out of my car in disbelief. My porch looked like a wedding magazine had exploded all over it. That's when Tom appeared from next door looking like he'd been dying to talk. "You're back," he said, barely containing his grin. "So, how was the wedding?" I blinked. What wedding? Oh, Karen's wedding, he said, dragging out the words like he was savoring them. You know, the one she held in your yard? I stared at him. Then I stared at my yard again. Then back at him. You're joking. I wish. And then, like a divine omen, Karen herself appeared. Dressed in a white sundress, hair still pinned up like she had just come from a brunch celebrating her own audacity. She beamed at me like we were old friends. Oh, you're back. I was hoping to clean up before you got home. Karen. I took a deep breath, trying to process. Did you hold a wedding on my property? She had the audacity to wave her hand dismissively. Oh, it was just a small gathering. I looked around. You decorated my house. There are chairs on my lawn. Well, technically it was a community event, she said, as if that justified trespassing on my land while I was gone. I had to physically restrain myself from laughing in absolute disbelief. You mean to tell me you planned an entire wedding, used my property, and didn't think I'd mind? He gave me a look. The same Karen look she always gave when she thought she was being completely reasonable. I assumed you wouldn't be using it, she said simply. And it was for the neighborhood. Everyone had a lovely time. I turned to Tom, who was doing a terrible job of hiding his amusement. Oh yeah, he nodded. It was lovely. I turned back to Karen, seeing red. Get everything. My property. Now. She actually sighed like I was being difficult. Fine, she huffed. I'll have someone come by later to pick up the chairs. No need to be so dramatic. I didn't even argue. I went inside, locked my door, and immediately called the police. Because Karen had officially gone too far. No. It was time for her downfall. The officers arrived within the hour. By then, I had taken plenty of pictures. Rose petals littering my walkway, chairs stacked on my lawn, even a stray champagne flute abandoned on my porch railing. The best part? Security camera footage. I pulled it up, and sure enough, there was Karen in all her entitled glory, directing the setup crew like she was the queen of some medieval kingdom, waving her hands and gesturing toward my lawn like she owned it. When the officers knocked on her door, she came out looking annoyed. Oh, this again, she scoffed, arms crossed. I already told him I'll have the chairs picked up. The officer raised an eyebrow. Ma'am, do you have permission from the homeowner to use their property for an event? Karen waved a hand, laughing like it was the most ridiculous question in the world. Oh, come on. It was just a small wedding. It's not like I damaged anything. The officer didn't laugh. Ma'am, trespassing is a serious offense. Using someone else's property without consent, especially for a private event, can result in legal consequences. That wiped the smug look off her face. Legal consequences? She repeated like the words personally offended her. Yes, the officer said, flipping through his notepad. We have security footage of the setup. You directed the event crew onto the property, which is criminal trespassing. Furthermore, there could be civil damages if the homeowner chooses to press charges. Karen's mouth opened, then closed, then opened again. But it was for the community, she tried, her voice shrill. Everyone had a wonderful time. Tom, who had been watching from his porch, burst out laughing. The officer was not amused. Ma'am, that doesn't change the fact that it wasn't your property. She turned to me, flailing dramatically. Why are you making such a big deal about this? I smiled. Because it is a big deal, Karen. The officers proceeded to inform her that the homeowner, me, had the right to press charges. Trespassing. Unauthorized use of private property. Potential damages. Fines. That was when the meltdown began. She launched into a full-scale tantrum, complete with arm flailing and screeching about harassment and overreaction. But the officers weren't buying it. In the end, she was issued a formal citation for trespassing. She tried to argue, but it wasn't optional. And the best part? The HOA got involved. See, when the footage spread through the neighborhood, because you bet I shared it, people lost it. The HOA had already been getting complaints about Karen's behavior, and this was the final straw. At the next HOA meeting, they held a vote. Karen was officially removed from her position. Not only that, but she was fined by the very HOA she had ruled over. You know what for? Hosting an unapproved event. That's right. The same woman who had spent years handing out fines for the most ridiculous infractions got hit with one herself. And for the first time in her entire reign of HOA terror. Karen was speechless. Karen never quite recovered from the wedding incident. Oh, she tried. 4 weeks after, she stomped around the neighborhood like a wounded queen, scowling at anyone who so much as looked in her direction. But something had shifted. She no longer had power. Without her precious HOA title, she was just another neighbor. One who had publicly embarrassed herself in front of the entire community. The final nail in the coffin? The HOA didn't just fine her. They banned her from ever holding a leadership role again. Which meant that for the first time in years the neighborhood was finally free. Tom threw an actual block party, fully HOA approved of course. People brought lawn chairs, grilled burgers, and laughed over how Karen's own rules had finally come back to bite her. Even old Mr. Jenkins showed up, rocking on his porch with a glass of sweet tea, his cat still wearing that tiny red bandana. And Karen? Oh, she stayed inside. Curtains drawn. Probably fuming that the very community she once ruled over was now celebrating her downfall. Then one morning a miracle happened. A for sale sign appeared on Karen's lawn. No big announcement. No farewell speeches. Just quiet defeat. Within 2 months she was gone. And after that, the grass grew freely. The mailboxes leaned at whatever angles they pleased. Flamingos, dozens of them, stood proudly in yards as a reminder that we had won. The HOA, once a tool of Karen's tyranny, finally focused on actual issues instead of imaginary crimes against neighborhood aesthetics. Me. I sat on my porch, sipping a cold drink, basking in the knowledge that Karen had finally been defeated. In the end, I had learned something important. Always install security cameras before going on vacation. Have you ever had a Karen in your neighborhood? What's the worst thing they ever did? If you were in my shoes, how would you have handled the wedding situation? Would you have pressed charges? What's the most ridiculous HOA rule you've ever heard of? Bonus points if you got fined for something totally absurd. If you could get revenge on an HOA Karen in a completely legal and hilarious way, what would you do?